you very much, Sue. What I'd like to do just to begin with is to thank ETAS for inviting me to speak here at the plenary. It's my first visit to ETAS, and to speak at a plenary is fantastic, so thank you very much for that. I also need to thank Mile, my sponsors. You'll see the name everywhere on the slide, so you won't be able to forget that. But also I want to thank you, because you stayed right to the end of the conference, and thank you very much for doing that. This slide is actually related to my talk. It's the first thing I saw when I came to Switzerland, when I arrived in Switzerland on Friday. Something in English to greet me. So the first language I saw, written language, was "great to see you." And it made me think, yes, what I'm talking about really is relevant. English is all around us, and it's something that we're going to be focusing on in this talk. But before we start talking about theories, start talking about activities, I'm going to get you just to sit back and relax for a few minutes. I'm going to get you to watch a very short video, and then we'll talk a little bit about it afterwards. Okay, good to hear some laughter at the beginning of the talk. That's fantastic. I didn't choose that to necessarily to get an emotional response from you, although I can see some of you are getting quite emotional. But for me, it's an indication of how English is being used in so many different places. That was actually an advertisement shown in Poland. It was completely in English. There's no Polish subtitles. It was used just before Christmas, and it was for an auction company. But it's an example of how English is used in so many different places now without subtitles. I can't imagine that happening in England. I can't imagine a French advert being shown in England with no subtitles. It just wouldn't happen, but it can happen with English because English is around us so much. I've just put this link on here, and I do want to let you know that at the end of the slides, my email address is there, and if you want a link to all of these, just email me and I'll be able to send you things through. But this link here, I don't know if you're aware of Film English. This is a really good site for using short clips in your classroom, and there's a whole lesson plan about that film there that you will be able to use. Okay, so what are we going to look at in this talk? We're going to look at, to begin with, the spread of English. Why is English used in so many places? Looking a little bit about the reasons for this, and how it's spreading and what we can use it for. But then we're going to go on and look at more practical ideas of how you can use the English around you in your environment. Because wherever you are in Switzerland and beyond, there will be English. And there are opportunities for learning around us and around our students wherever we are. But the title or the subtitle of the talk is The Good, the Bad and the Ugly. So I'm going to set you a little task just with the person next to you. For you, what is good English? What is bad English? And what is ugly English? Just see if you can think of any examples. I'll just give you a minute or two. Okay, can I stop you there? Would anyone like to give an example of something they think is good English, or what they might consider good English to be?
Clear English.
So in terms of articulation? Yeah? Okay. Anything else?
Careless with vocabulary, so that the listener doesn't have to make all the effort to fill the gaps.
Okay, thank you. Anything else?
Any English that doesn't have any ugly English in it.
Okay. For those of you here, any English doesn't have any ugly English in it. Good English. Okay, so we'll maybe define ugly English in a little while.
Language that expresses who the person is with authenticity, with With vibration.
Okay, right. So expressive English puts the personality of the person across, I guess you're trying to say there. Yeah, okay.
Getting your message across.
Okay, getting the message across. Okay, so maybe not necessarily being 100% accurate. So we've got different opinions of what good English is, which I think is healthy, but we'll come on to that in a little while. Good English? Somewhat dated, someone say, but yeah, absolutely. It depends on the context as well, doesn't it? Beautiful English, but maybe it's not always relevant to speak like this. So it does depend a little bit what the context is. What about bad English? What would you say is bad English?
Commercial English, like I'm loving
Yeah, when language is being distorted for commercial.
the one you showed is.
Yeah, okay, yeah, thank you.
When you don't understand the message.
When the message can't be understood, so the opposite to what this lady was saying here. Yeah, anything else for bad English?
We felt that on some level there isn't really bad English as long as the person is authentically trying to communicate and attempting perhaps to improve or to get a message across.
Okay, do the rest of you hear that? Okay, great, thank you. Bad English, or according to what Eva just said, you're getting the message across, it's authentic, so maybe it's fine. Maybe it's good English, I don't know. You're the loveliest thing I ever saw, in it. What kind of English is that, where you use in it a lot? Sorry. Estuary English, originally coming from question tags, okay. Caribbean English has got a lot of influence on using in it, and sort of London Caribbean English, Jamaican English, we use in it. But it's used a lot, it's a common way of speaking in a lot of places in London and in the Caribbean as well. So, is it bad? I'm not necessarily going to give you all the answers, it's to think about, yeah? Okay, so ugly English. If you don't feel comfortable, you don't need to give an example, but you could give a suggestion.
Rap songs.
Rap songs, okay?
Yeah.
All right, ugly English, yeah, okay.
No matter how perfect grammar or vocabulary might be, it could be language of hate, of repression, of prejudice, disrespect.
So that when the message or the intent is ugly. Yeah, okay, all right. Can I ask this gentleman, rap English, why rap English would be ugly for you?
Well, I mean, there are obviously some good rap. There's positive rap. But I'm saying quite often, unfortunately, in rap songs you find violence and English that most of us was not there to speak.
Okay, yeah, okay. Anyone else? Okay. I've blanked it out, but yeah, you can probably guess what goes in the gap there. For a lot of people, swearing, bad language, but also what you said about bad intent, hate, so the message being ugly. Maybe not necessarily the words themselves, but the message being
And then
ugly.
again, it's the context, because that word, we saw the elderly grandpa saying it was rubber duck in the bath, and we all laughed.
Yeah.
Because the context is totally different.
Absolutely. So context is really important when we're looking at what we understand by good, bad and ugly. And maybe it's not as easy as we might superficially think, just to categorise into this is good English, this is bad English, this is ugly English. What's the context? Is it authentic? What's the meaning behind it? All of that is important as well. This isn't going to become a historical lecture, this will be very brief, but why is English everywhere? I'm not going to talk about the empire and all of that, that's quite a long time in the past now, but recently we're talking a little bit about capitalism, the digital revolution, globalisation. That's why we find English around us in in so many places now, particularly digital revolution, and that's kind of led in a way to globalization. But I think we have to accept this sentence at the bottom, that those three things have allowed more people to have access to English, and the more that different people use English, the more likely it is that English is going to change. More people will have ownership of English. And this quote shows very well that we don't own English. As when I'm saying we, I'm talking about English, native English speaking people don't own English. This has changed. Anglophones don't own English anymore. 75% of English usage is between non-native speakers. And that means that non-native speakers have ownership of English as well, and have the right to use it how they want and change it. I don't know if you're familiar with Jean-Paul Nevière. He was a businessman, a French businessman, and he saw this need for business people to be able to talk to each other in English. And interestingly, he found when he was in business meetings with maybe just one native English speaker, and a lot of non-native English speakers, it was the native English speaker who was getting left out, because everyone else was speaking at a slightly different kind of level, using slightly different vocabulary, which was easy for them all to comprehend. But the native English speaker was trying to speak at a higher level, and he wasn't getting involved as much. And this made Nevière think, I think there's a language which would be useful to teach people. And he invented Globish. I don't know if you've heard of Globish. He produced a book about speaking Globish. And it was mainly aimed at the business community. They had 1,500 essential words to be able to communicate in simple language. And so in a way, focusing on Globish could be something that's quite useful because it allows for basic communication. We're not talking about perfect communication, but as this lady said here, if you can communicate in some way, you're getting your message across, then maybe that's enough. There's also a review of Globish. Robert McCrum is a writer and a linguist, and he wrote a review of Globish saying how useful it was. There was a lot in the early 2000s talking about the usefulness of Globish. However, it's not very authentic. And while a lot of people said it would be useful to teach our students, actually our students see a lot wider language than just these 1,500 words. All you need to do is step out into the high street out here and you see a lot of words that wouldn't be in the 1,500. So I think we need to look wider, and this is what this talk is about, noticing the wider language that's around us and trying to get our students to focus on that, not narrowing them to, for example, Globish, or even to maybe what the coursebook is trying to provide them with, because they'll see so much more around them that if we say, no, you should only do this, it's not going to work. Because they see English around the world, on the World Wide Web, in entertainment, movies, and of course in advertising. I think advertising is probably the biggest area where people see English around the world. So we're going to look at a few examples of where we might see English. And some of them are quite local, and some of them are from further away. I'm not going to ask for your opinions on these, but you might have in your mind whether you think they fit into your category of what might be good, bad, or ugly English. As I say, I'm going to leave that categorisation to you at the moment. So I was looking through the FC Zurich website the other day and I came across this advert, all in English. So somebody who was really into football, maybe didn't know a lot of English, but is just faced with this on the website. And so I'm not commenting on where this might fit. I'm not really sure where it might fit, actually. I think sometimes some of the strangest translations we see seem to be from China, but this one's interesting. This is a lovely sentiment, and this is actually a subtitle from a Farsi music video. But this wasn't the subtitle, this is what I've put, but the actual subtitle was this. Doesn't quite have the same ring about it. Makes you feel not quite so special. There's a lot of English on this. The thing I find interesting is the use of laugh up. Because for me it's a new phrase. I wouldn't normally say laugh up, but it kind of makes sense to me. And I love this creativity with English as well. And I think we shouldn't be afraid to be creative. You stand up, you laugh up, you cough up. So you can use lots of different ways of playing with language. And sometimes it happens accidentally, I think, with non-native speakers of English, but then it continues and catches on, and then becomes part of standard English. So language change is going to happen, maybe because of the way that it's used in other countries. As an example of how we could get our students maybe to correct some English that they noted. I don't know if you're aware of this song. If you look at the title there, this has been a #1 song across Europe, including in Switzerland over the last 6 weeks or so. So it's another example of how English is around in music. We all know it's around in music, but I thought it'd be nice to have a short musical interlude for you to reflect on that. We'll come back to that song later because we're going to look at an activity that relates to that. So that's one reason I wanted to show you that. But again, just to think how much English is around us in music and to get you reflecting on that. Interestingly, this was in a very small village in Spain. It wasn't in Madrid or, it was a very, very small village, but obviously it's a national campaign for the bank. And so, even in very, very small places, you often see quite a lot of English. So, we've got the word noticing here. Again, I'm just going to ask you for a minute to talk to the person next to you. What do you understand by noticing? It's quite a wide question, but I'm keeping it wide for a reason. So what do you understand by noticing? Okay, I'm going to stop you again there. Can I have just 1 or 2 suggestions?
Being observant.
Okay, being observant, yeah.
Becoming aware.
Yeah, becoming aware, lovely.
Spotting something in detail without even realising that.
Okay, yeah, spotting.
Something stands out.
Yeah, okay, lovely.
It could be, by yourself, or you could be guided.
Okay, yeah, and that's something we're going to look at. We're going to look at both of those, guided and by yourself noticing. Because the idea that English is all around us is something which is interesting, but if we don't notice it, and if our students don't notice it, then it's a waste, really. It's there, and it's something that we could make use of. For me, I've got interested in noticing through studying other languages. More recently, going back to studying, looking at noticing German, because I've been in Switzerland, Austria and Germany a few times in the last couple of years, and it started me noticing my German again. I studied German and French at university, but it's a long time since I'd really used it. And I thought, oh, that's interesting. Oh, that word's interesting. And so my own language learning experience started me recognising and noticing things around me. But I also noticed missed opportunities that my students have. Now, I teach in the UK, and my students have opportunities all around them to notice English. And sometimes I get very frustrated that they don't seem to see what's right in front of them. And so it made me think of ways of trying to encourage them to notice more, to see what was around them more. And finally, I'm keen on learner autonomy, encouraging learner autonomy. And I found this was a way of getting my students to take a little bit more responsibility for their own development of their language, and also focusing on areas that they were interested in, rather than me saying, please be interested in that. And I found that that was something that was quite interesting. This is quite old, this quote now, but it's still frequently referred to in noticing theory. The idea that you do have to kind of do something to remember something. And you have to maybe set out with an aim to notice. So I was quite interested, the lady up there said, you spot something. Sometimes you do, sometimes you're not looking and you spot something. But very often we're encouraging our students to notice things around them, and they then get into a habit of noticing after that. So usually my first aim with my students is to try to develop student interest somehow. And I usually do this in the classroom. I don't have to go further than the wall at the back of the classroom. And I show them something like this. You may have seen this or not, but take a minute to try to guess what may fit in the gap. Any suggestions? Other objects? Okay, anything else? You can be creative. Hands. Pets. Okay. Hands, pets, yeah, okay, yeah. Yep, okay. Marijuana, okay. That's the kind of creativity we want. Okay, excellent, okay. Now, you're unlikely to see this on a Swiss train, but this was on a train in the UK, and quite a lot of the trains now seem to have these humorous little notices to try to make people take notice of what they should or shouldn't be doing. And for me, it's a nice example of getting students to notice language which is unusual, which they maybe might not be expecting. Something a lot simpler, which you might see in Switzerland, is this. And maybe easier to guess. Plug? Okay, yeah, anything else? Unclutter, that's nice, yeah. Undo. Unchain, yeah. So, yeah. It's actually unwire your life, so it's not a normal word, it's kind of playing a little bit with language, but again, I think for me it's nice to get my students to notice that you can play around with language. We don't always see what we expect. We can, with the first example, have fun with language, and the second, we can create new words. That's fine. We'll come on in a little while to thinking about when it's fine and when it isn't, because I know very often with your teacher's hat on, when you've got to focus on tests and exams, we can't say to our students, yeah, just make up a word and put that in the test. It's not going to work. But yeah, there are times when it is possible as well. We've got the word unfair here. And another activity, sometimes I like to get my students to think about is when they're using their own language, what English appears in their own language. And I put specifically there, learners L1, because I'm guessing it's the same situation with you. You may have students whose L1 is different. You might have students who L1 might be Romanian, it might be, I don't know, Arabic, it might be, it probably will be German or French. But thinking and comparing as a class, which words do we use from English in our normal language? Can you think of any words in German that may cause confusion when used in English? So these are English words, but they maybe have a different meaning in German.
Mobbing.
Mobbing, okay, mobbing, handy, fantastic. Again? Become, okay, yes. Incompetent, okay, these false friends, great. Again? Chef, yeah, okay. So, a few examples here where English is used in German, but the meaning is different. Okay? And I'm not being too German-centric here. Let's think about French as well.
Brushing.
Brushing, okay, fantastic, yeah. So what's le scotch in French? Tape, sellotape, okay. Not a drink, no, okay. And fashion victim is positive or negative? In French it tends to be positive, yeah? Someone who dresses very well, whereas in English it's very derogatory. You say someone's a fashion victim, oh God, they think about clothes too much, stop it. So it's quite different. And le fooding. This was actually a word that was invented by two journalists in France in 1999. They wanted to try to have an idea of a word that gave the idea of feeling and food together, kind of casual dining. And they came up with this word fooding. I don't know whether it's used that much. Has anyone heard of it? Okay, but apparently this is an attempt to try to create a British-sounding word, an English-sounding word to use in French. Okay, if we move on a little bit, I want to think about getting our students to notice language and how we can get the students to then start making notes of language they see around them. And an obvious one is collections, collecting words. Words beginning with or collect words or phrases related to. For me, the second one is better than the first, because the first, you don't know what you're going to get. It can be so wide, the students are just writing words they don't understand. Whereas the second one, collecting words related to a specific topic, hopefully they're seeing them in a context and they're taking them out of that context. I don't know if you're familiar with this portfolio. This is something which Rosemary Smeets-Carole, who works at the PH in Schwyz, has put together. It's a language portfolio for primary children, and it's for them to start discovering languages on their own. One of the things that she has done is to have collect words in any language beginning with the same letter. And this is at primary level, and it's supposed to be over a year. They just write any words that they see, but it's getting them interested in language. And so this has the same kind of idea behind it. But there can be dangers in collecting language you notice. I had a teacher who was with us at Nile from Algeria. She got really excited when she got back to Algeria and sent me a list of all of the English words she saw in her village when she got back. And the list looked like this. The one that I was a bit worried about was this one. Only worried in a kind of humorous way. But there was such a vast range of language. You think, if you're a teacher, what do you do with that amount of language that's coming into you? Because there's so many different things. There's mistakes, there's a range of different type of language there, and your students said, oh look, this is what I've collected. Great, what do I do with that? So, looking at what to do with it is really important. And I think the first thing to think about is narrowing the focus. Because if students just collect language and hand it to you, it's going to be tricky for you as a teacher and also for them. It could demotivate them. So I like to think about things in stages. And we talked a little bit about guiding students, and I think the lower level students will be more guided. And as a teacher, I often ask my students, how many times do you see the word around you? In the next week, just look for this word in your environment. How many times do you see it? It's very, very limited, but it's getting them noticing. And obviously choose a word that you know exists. You've already had a look around and seen that the word, I don't know, food or sale or something is, coffee is around. We'll have a look at language trail in a minute. We've looked at words related to, words beginning with. Notice the mistake. We had some examples earlier where there were examples of English with mistakes in, and getting students to notice mistakes at a higher level is a good idea, but maybe not so much at lower level because again they might not notice them. And my favourite activity, but again for higher levels, is just getting students to stand and listen, or sit and listen, to some English around them. When I arrived here on Friday, I went to an Asian takeaway just around the corner from the hotel where I was. And I just sat and I was eating, and there was an American guy and I think a Swiss-German guy from the accent talking about algebra. It was a really kind of deep conversation, but I just heard these words floating every so often about various things relating to algebra, but then other words as well. And I think if I was an English student, I could just note down a few words I heard, just listen to English floating around me and note down what I hear. It can be quite interesting. So, I said I was going to say something about language trails. In the UK, I'm lucky, I live in a city that I can ask my students to have a wander around and notice language. I often send them on a trail where they look for specific language. But it's possible to do that wherever you are, if you know where the language is. So for example, I'm going to pick on somewhere in the French-speaking part of Switzerland, Neuchâtel, and let's focus in on that. We're going to focus in on Rue du Stéon in Neuchâtel, and a little trail that I devised for my students there. It's very simple, it gets them out of the classroom, or they do it for homework, which is probably more likely. Put a cross on the map where you see these things. You know these things exist there. They're just looking for things in English, but they're noticing English around them. Or to make it a little bit more difficult, I put the crosses, they have to write what they see, what do they notice, so they're having to look a little bit more. And then maybe thinking, why is it in English? When they come back to the class, why is that word in English? Why isn't it in French? So thinking about marketing, thinking about the role of English, thinking about why English is so cool. So narrowing the focus, some of the things I ask my students to do, so again, so I don't get too much, only collect words you recognise. It stops them bringing in words which they don't understand, which they have to then ask you about. Or just bring in one word you didn't know. Yeah? Again, don't bring in too many. The trail or the task we just looked at. Keeping to a topic. And I think really important, this idea, I'm not a walking dictionary. I'm not going to come in, you're not going to come in and ask me all these questions about I saw this word, what does it mean? No, I'm not a walking dictionary. There's a time and a place for this. And we'll talk a little bit about setting rules and setting limits. So looking at an ongoing collection, and we're looking again at how students can collect words and over time focus on them, but not have that I want to know now thing about them. There's lots of activities once the students have collected words. Guess the context. We've done guess the missing word. Students explain to each other why they chose things. Peer teaching. We're going to look at spot the difference and poster activities. The song. I actually found a forum about this song. It's a Swiss forum. But someone had posted completely in English, there's all this German and all this French, and then someone posted just in English on it. And it got me thinking, if one of my students brought this in and said, hey, I read this, I'd think, oh God, what am I going to do with it? I mean, there's some quite difficult vocabulary in that. And so, spot the difference could work. See if you can spot the difference. The words in red aren't perfect synonyms, but they're good enough for students to be able to notice the difference and hopefully notice some new vocabulary. So it's getting students not only to notice the language in the first place on the blog, but to also notice some specific vocabulary which might be useful for them. I got my students to go into town and to listen, and these are some of the words they noticed, and they came back and wrote posters afterwards. So this is what I mean by poster presentation. And they said why I liked the word. Or I usually have a rule as well. If they're doing a poster and they're presenting it to the group, they have to know what the word means. It's also their homework to go and find out what the word means. If they come in and expect me to go through every poster and explain to the class, no, this is their word, they've chosen it, they share it and explain it. I don't know where this student was, but they were obviously in a very interesting situation in Norwich Market or somewhere, I don't know. Here. It's a bit of a mixture of phrases, discombobulated with, get off my back. I don't quite know how those two go together, but... We talked a little bit about bad and ugly language, and we've got different ways of talking about what we mean by bad and ugly language. But sometimes we don't necessarily want particularly ugly language, whatever we see that to be in the classroom, or we want to limit it. So what do we do about it? One of the things I think relates a little bit to what Herbert Puchter was saying this morning is this idea of critical thinking and getting students to categorise language, to think about when certain language is appropriate and when it isn't appropriate. And so, for example, we know the kind of language that's appropriate for the first certificate exam. But we also know the kind of language that's appropriate when people are going out together and having a good time. We know language which is inappropriate, for example, because it's offensive. And it could be offensive in this situation, but not in another situation. So categories of language can be a good way of getting students to analyse language and also to start thinking about language appropriacy. You might want to set limits as well. You might say to students, I don't want you to bring any swearing back into class. And if, as a teacher, that's something that you think is important, then you set the limits for that. You may remember Sarah Mercer talked a little bit about setting limits is important. Student-generated suggestions is important as well, but there probably needs to be a balance. You might want to get your students to decide what kind of language they want to focus on. But as the teacher, you're the person in control of the classroom. What are you happy with in the classroom and what you're not happy with? By allow time for feedback, I mean getting students to bring language to you before it's delivered to the rest of the class. You are then the filter for passing on language to the rest of the class. So maybe students give you their examples and then a week later you decide which of those examples are useful to work with the class. Students will soon work out which language you decide not to share with the class, so it's no point in collecting that kind of language again. I'm sorry this isn't very clear, it's just to remind you, if those of you who were here yesterday at Jeremy's talk, he said in this quote, nothing motivates students more than when they discover the meaning behind a subject of their own accord. And so for me, what I said before about putting the onus on the students for discovering the language and for explaining the language themselves is really important. Noticing doesn't have to always be outside, and I tend to start training my students in the classroom first, noticing what's going on maybe in the course book. Although this is very old, and a lot of people kind of now disagree that learners can't learn the grammatical features unless they notice them, I do think there's some truth still in that. I think once you notice things and notice how things work, whether it's grammar or vocabulary, that's when you start being able to use the language. And so getting students to notice the language, even in course books, could be really useful. And so these are some of the categories that you might want to get your students to think about. The first three in particular have the word I in them. The students are choosing the language they like themselves, language I want to remember, language I like, language I want to be able to use. It's not language the teachers told me to learn for the test, it's language that I've noticed that I really like. And then this can be spread to language that I notice outside the classroom that I like, that I want to use, etc. So, just ways of collecting this language. You know, students are bringing language in, what can we do? I often use noticing sheets. Each of my students has a sheet, and they just keep a collection of language that they notice. And every so often, maybe on a Friday afternoon, they share their favourite language with each other, and we discuss it. But usually, before that, I've had a look through, and I've said, I want you to share that one, or that one, or that one. If there's anything inappropriate, then I tell them I don't want them to share it. Blog posts, at NAR we've got a blog called Linguistic Landscapes, and when any interesting language appears, we take a photo and we put it on our website. I don't know if you're familiar with the news satire programme Have I Got News For You in the UK. This was a play on words for this. This was a church near where I live that was selling the pews in the church. So it decided to have this poster saying, have I got pews for you? Come and buy a pew. So that was a nice way of noticing language. But with technology now, students can take photos and share in this way as well. Again, on my little visit round to the co-op from my hotel here, I spotted this. Partylicious, yeah, it's a new word, but party and delicious, this is sort of portmanteau word we've got here. But it's lovely. I could have taken probably 50 photos in the supermarket of use of English, and so even just in one small place, there's so much English around that we can try to get our students to focus on and notice what's happening with language. Particularly if we limit it down to one topic or one theme, then we can start working on the language in detail. Class collections, maybe a poster, students come in and write their ideas, the things they see. A post box, students post their ideas, the teacher takes them away, looks at them, decides if they're appropriate or not, and then decides what to do with them. And learner notebooks, getting students to become much more autonomous in their learning. And sometimes using headings in learner notebooks can be useful. This kind of speaks for itself. The more students notice what's around them, the more autonomous they get, the more language they're choosing for themselves that they want to learn. The final thing says critical thinking, Herbert, but it should say Herbert Puchter. I want to give you a couple of minutes just to think how you can link this to encouraging a growth mindset, to investigating other tribes, those who were here yesterday evening, and to critical thinking, which I've already talked about a little bit, Herbert Puchter. So can I give you a couple of minutes to think how language noticing could fit into those three areas? Okay, let's just stop there. We've got a couple of minutes left, so any suggestions? Encouraging a growth mindset. How can noticing the language around you help encourage our learners' growth mindset?
Well, then it's possible to come up with new words and why you're issues.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. For some reason, the way clicks have gone funny. What I did have there was, yes, I can. Just getting the students to believe they can look for language on their own. They can be independent learners. They're not learners who are fixed with the coursebook. They can look beyond the coursebook and become more confident as notices of English. What about investigating other tribes? This might be a bit of a tricky one. You might have to see inside my head to try to get this one, which might be a bit hard.
But you could look at other,
Sorry, yeah.
you could look at other, for instance, the chocolate box, for instance, start looking at other industries, as it were, sales, business, whatever, manufacture.
Absolutely, yeah. So looking at completely different topics. Yeah.
Maybe also being more tolerant of what you were showing earlier, being creative with language or coming across language that you haven't learned in a formal setting and being more open to that.
Absolutely. I mean, that's, I think you've seen it inside my head, because that's one of the things that I was thinking of in particular, this idea of what is bad language. Maybe sometimes we see things which we think is bad language, but maybe we don't understand the context. Or maybe we see something which is incorrect English, but does it really matter? So sort of getting your head around that kind of thing, seeing things from a different angle. And critical thinking, I spoke about already, relating to Herbert Puchter, this idea of students analysing language, analysing mistakes in language, analysing when we can use certain types of language and categorising. If you email me for the slides, there's some references on there that you might want to have a look at. And also the links to the film English and to the information about Globish as well. So I think as the conference finishes and you're going back to wherever you're teaching, it's an opportunity for you to have a look around a little bit closer at the English that's around you and what your students might be able to do with it. And as you leave, please pick up an activity card called English Everywhere. There's a QR reader on that, and it will take you to more activities for both teaching and teacher training that are on our website. So please help yourselves to those as you leave. Thank you.